Let's pretend you're a designer at Brace Yourself Games working on Phantom Brigade. You've prototyped and tested your main innovation, which is the timeline mechanic. One unique thing your timeline-less players do is move and attack at the same time. Now here's the next design problem to solve. What's preventing players from queuing up attack commands back to back at every turn? Why is this a problem? Well, a big part of tactics games is making strategic decisions. So if each turn you just spam each mech's timeline with attack commands, you won't quite be making too many nuanced decisions. So what would you do? Pretend you're a designer working on this problem. Where would you start? One reasonable place would be to take a look at other tactics games and see how they handle this. XCOM has an ammo mechanic, and that works quite well for them. Each gun can shoot a certain number of times before you need to reload it, and when you do reload, you spend a turn to do so. This works really well for XCOM, since deciding when to reload ends up introducing a lot of tactical decision making. If you reload too early, you'd have wasted a turn, and if you reload too late, your character might be caught in a pinch where you really need them to be shooting. Now, a reload solution could work really well with the timeline. You introduce a reload action, and after a few attack commands, the player can queue it up. One nice thing about this is it gives you two levers to balance weapons with. The first lets you define the number of attacks before a reload, and the second, which would be unique to Phantom Brigade, would be how long the reload action actually takes per weapon. Now, while this is an okay solution, it isn't ideal. There's a few pros here. It's a system players already know from other tactics games, so they don't need to learn something new. And as we said, it also gives you a couple of knobs to tweak and balance weapons with. And lastly, it works really well with the timeline mechanic since it would just be another action. But you see, there are some serious downsides here. First of all, thematically, it goes a tiny bit against Phantom Brigade's focus on upfront action by introducing a forced downtime. Second, and more importantly, it doesn't quite solve the problem, it just delays it. You see, with a solution like this, you could still spam attack commands, you just need to occasionally add the reload action. So this solution isn't ideal. What else can you do? How about a cooldown mechanic? Time is a core focus in Phantom Brigade anyway, so adding some sort of cooldown action could work really well. You just need to tweak some things to make it fit the timeline. Maybe something like, after each attack, your timeline automatically adds a cooldown action whose duration varies based on the weapon. That way we still have a lever we can use to balance weapons with. Now the pros here are, it's still reasonably easy to understand, thematically it resonates really well with the timeline, and where before reloads didn't quite solve the attack stacking problem, cooldowns do since you'd force a reload action after each attack. What are the cons? Well, there aren't that many. You might say it takes some agency away from the player's ability to make their own decisions by forcing the cooldown action, or it simplifies combat a little bit since the rhythm now is attack, cooldown, but overall it's not bad. You might leave it here, most designers would have. But the designers behind Brace Yourself Games weren't satisfied. They went with a different solution. Their solution is as follows. Each gun when shot generates a certain amount of heat. Each mech can sustain a certain amount of heat before it starts taking damage. So you could queue up multiple attack commands, but you deal a lot of damage to your mech and even potentially blow them up. The reason this solution is better than the first two is because it adds a lot of nuance to your decision making. It adds an exciting risk-reward element to attacking, since you could dip into the heat damage to add an extra attack or two as the situation calls for. And with this, players now have an extra tool they can play around with. And what's even better is that the designers then took this mechanic and piped it into the rest of the game. Some weapons generate more heat than others, different mechs can handle different amounts of heat, and all this comes together to make the game a lot richer. So the pros? It adds a new vector of tactical decision making that is fun to play with, it adds a risk-reward element which always makes decision making more exciting, and lastly, it is piped into the rest of the game's mechanics. And as for cons, well, it's another new mechanic people need to learn, but honestly in this case the designers accepted that trade-off. If you are coming from a different tactics game, Phantom Brigade requires some upfront learning, but the mechanics overall stay reasonably simple. Okay, so this was all a made-up scenario to demonstrate the core nugget worth sharing. When working on Phantom Brigade, the devs very well could have gone with any number of ways to fix the attack stacking problem. And instead of going with something conventional for the genre, they innovated, and in doing so, they found something that complemented their game really well. So if you're ever in a position where you're working through a problem on your game, try not to think of any old solution, but instead try to think of one that fits incredibly well with the rest of your game. As always gamers, thank you so much for watching. If you learned anything or found this video enjoyable, please leave a comment, like, and consider subscribing. I appreciate you all, and we'll see you again next time.